First off, obviously, want to welcome Mr. Dan Melone, Archaeologist to the Stars, who will be joining us and answering a lot of your questions that were submitted to us, and also will be telling some of our war stories. So thanks for joining us on this lovely October evening.
Yes, that is correct. Fall has come back. It has returned. And thank you again for having me on the show. Last week being the first time, of course.
There we go. This started out, of course, as a way to give people something to do that is not, while we're in quarantine, while we're in lockdown. And right now we're not really in much of a lockdown anymore, although it is still advisable to stay home as much as you can. Above all, just avoid crowds. And unfortunately, we're seeing some really big spikes in positive tests in a negative way, COVID-wise. And it's always hard to know what those numbers mean because is it just because we're doing more tests that we're getting more positives? But the really scary thing is in Arizona, where a lot of my family is right now, they are going into a kind of an emergency protocol for their hospitals as they are in the upper 70% of capacity already. So really everybody it's fun to go out in the summer, and obviously I want to be doing so much more than I am doing, but please stay as safe as possible. It's continued to be a very historic week since I was last on, where the protests have continued, and who knows how much that might be spreading things as well. But lots of positive change in America. We will come out on the other side of this way stronger. Oh yeah, it's 100 degrees in Arizona, my mom chimes in. It is freezing. This morning it was mid-80s and like 80% humidity. I thought I was in Florida. It was swelteringly, miserably hot. And then as Dan and I were sitting out here working on some other projects together, the temperature just absolutely plummeted. I mean, I think all of us, well, first off, we all see Indiana Jones when we think of archaeology. Also, most of us also incorrectly think you guys are looking for dinosaur bones.
Yeah.
Which right off the bat, archaeology is the study of past humans. So animals, they play a role, but you're not looking for dinosaur bones.
Right.
So if you could talk maybe a little bit about what an archaeologist is, and then also how you got started in this field.
So archaeologists look for pieces of the past to put together the way people had lived, essentially. So we'll look for things that people typically left behind. Basically, we're rooting through the old garbage. And it really helps, especially with groups that didn't have any forms of writing or where very little is known about them. So basically, it's better to go through and try to figure out what is going on by the site, by the things that had been left behind at the site due to the lack of writing. And yes, animals do play a large role when we look through the materials left behind from basically kitchens, middens, things like that. So, for example, there are sites around here where I've found fish bone and clam shells and things like that told me that that specific group of prehistoric people ate these things, found next to the river in a midden. A midden is a trash pile. It's where they would dump all of their refuse into one area. Much like the way people out in rural areas do today. They'll take their trash down further off on their property and leave it or burn it or whatever. So, and I got interested in this, quite honestly, since the first grade. My neighbor across the street was an archaeologist. She was the first female curator in a museum in Belgrade, Mrs. Yusepovich. And she is the one that got me interested in archaeology. And my mother arranged for me to go to her house and to sit and learn about what archaeology is. And right off the bat, she told me it was nothing like Indiana Jones. There was a lot of research and learning, education, what have you, that went into it. And the things that we learn today will be wrong 10 years down the line, basically. So it's constantly evolving. So
Sure.
yeah.
And we'll talk at some point, probably sooner than later, about Robinson Woods, which is kind of what brought us together and how we first met, and a source of a lot of the work we did together. Especially because we are doing this on the What's Your Ghost Story page, which of course most of our viewers will be wanting to talk about ghost stories. And I have had the opportunity to bring you in on a number of not paranormal investigations, but places where there were legends and I was trying to find things, and you were able to help me find some of those physical remnants of what is left behind. And it was just so much fun and so interesting to see how you can read the land as opposed to just a novice, just as somebody, your average person walking in the woods. And many people that have seen me speak have heard me talk about when I brought you to Independence Grove, which is this beautiful forest preserve area in Libertyville, Illinois. And it's got all sorts of legends about it. Urban legends, for sure. I mean, the legends that are really famous are probably not based on any truth, but I always feel like those things they come from some element of truth, and we just don't know what they are. And whatever the case, even though I've never experienced anything there myself, I've had so many amazing firsthand accounts that explain people being chased by phantom screams that seem to chase them and go with them as they are fleeing through the woods and getting to their car, and the screams are just right on their heels as they're running away. Really a horrifying place, and there were all of these legends about there being a school back there or a camp or an orphanage, all of these different things, and then lo and behold, you go through the research and it was actually all of those different types of structures. These buildings did serve all of those purposes over the years. And I would hear legends also that there were ruins of these buildings left behind. And I would do the basic thing, like, okay, I'll look on Google Earth, see what I can see, which you can see a little bit. But then I would try to go in person and find things, and I would just come up empty. It's all overgrown. It's wild now for the most part. And then the first time bringing you there, my mind was blown immediately, because we're walking through these woods, and of course I'm carrying with me all the knowledge of the ghost stories and the terrifying experiences. And you go, oh look! And I'm thinking it's going to be some like severed flaming head flying at us or something. And you're like, look, it's a pine tree. I'm like, what?
Although a severed flying burning head would have been.
I mean, that would have been pretty sweet too. But I thought, are you on some weird scavenger hunt I'm unaware of? And you're like, no, look, we're in an oak forest. Why would there be a pine tree there unless it was landscaped? If it was planted there by humans at once upon a time, which means that there's probably foundations near there. And we walked over to it, and lo and behold, we found all sorts of ruins. And we did this all day long, and that was awesome. And I like that being a good archaeologist, you need to have a knowledge of so many different types of things. A lot of times all that's left when glass breaks are the tops of bottles. Mm-hmm. So just the part where the cap would go on, the cap or the cork or the screw top, whatever. But you could always look at it and see what time frame it is, because you have some knowledge on manufacturing history.
Everything from building archaeology to understanding how buildings work, how they were built in the past, and how they're built in the present, to compare and contrast and what have you, to simple everyday items such as a bottle. Look at a bottle, it's just a bottle, but yeah, I mean, it's a bottle, but this bottle happens to be 200 years old compared to this bottle, which is post 1900. And just sometimes you can look at the manufacturing, you can look at what is labeled on the bottle, you can maybe find stamps and things like that, but sometimes we use a little trick by looking at the seam of the bottle. When the bottle is put together during the manufacturing process, it leaves a little seam, and the higher up that seam goes, the more, or the higher into the 1800s it is. And once that seam reaches the top, it's basically 1900 and afterwards. So that's one of the ways to look at it. Ceramics are pretty much the same way. You look at ceramics, you can tell whether or not they've been painted by hand, or what is called transferware, where the image is basically transferred to the piece of ceramic, what will become the plate. But it's interesting to always find pieces of ceramics with the pottery stamps on the bottom, the maker's mark. And from that point, you can really get a whole story. You might not have the whole plate or the teacup or what have you, but you can find a whole story just using that maker's mark, when it was manufactured, what time frame it was manufactured between, because those maker marks changed over time as the company progressed, and even if the company went out of business, you can place it within a certain period.
Sure.
So, yeah.
That's cool. And so I guess we'll stop burying the lead. Robinson Woods. So Robinson Woods is a place I've talked about a little bit on here in the past, and I had one of my most extreme paranormal experiences there, and then continue to have kind of lighter but regular experiences there whenever I went back. Almost all the time. I always say at least 75% of the time which is not at all common when it comes to visiting haunted places, to have that regular of an encounter of some sort that you can't explain away. And so what was the research I was going on said a couple of things. It said that the Peterson Schussler boys were murdered probably around here and their bodies dumped here, and that also that same year the last living Robinson family member descendant, their house burned down and they moved away and died later. Mm-hmm. And so there were no Robinsons left around from this family. And find out pretty quickly upon talking to you that that neither of those things are true. Those elements happened, but not right there, not exactly like that. And also, I think the second time I met Dan, he said, "Did you want to meet a Robinson family descendant?" Which means that obviously there are still Robinsons in existence and actually all over America. But let's just talk about. I can go on, and I know you can too, about how important Alexander Robinson was, and actually just who he was before we even get into the location, as briefly as possible, because we can go on a very long time. He's a very important person in the history of the Midwest.
Yes, correct. I mean, essentially, Robinson Woods, and those of you that know me know that it holds a special place in my heart. I mean, I've dedicated a large portion of my life to it. And by the way, this shout out to Kathleen Wicks. I started writing that book today. You'll remember that, or recall that I was stuck on 1979. Well, I've started to get into it again, so hopefully we'll have that finished soon. And it's about the cemetery, for those of you that don't know, the Robinson Woods Cemetery. But essentially, Robinson was definitely an integral part of early Chicago's history, and helping to build Chicago, really. He and other mixed-blood Native Americans, as well as some of the full-blood Native chiefs, worked with the American settlers to build Chicago, bring in education systems, Catholicism, voting, and things like that, to basically create an industrial Chicago in the 1830s. And if it really, quite honestly, if it weren't for them, for the natives, the Native American influence, we wouldn't have the Chicago that we have today. And Robinson definitely was a big part of that. He, Billy Caldwell, especially, helping with petitions to get the first Catholic priest here. And at the same time, once that priest arrived to Chicago, helped to build the first school with him, first church, and then helped to work on the first school. So they did quite a bit with the early settlers. There's much more, but we would be sitting here for hours chatting. He also was someone who looked to the future. In his eyes, he knew what was coming, and unfortunately, that meant the removal of Native Americans in the Chicagoland area. And we all know that wasn't right and how these things happened with the removal process, but Robinson sort of took advantage of that after a fashion. He and many of the other local chiefs did, because they owned businesses and they worked hand in hand with the Americans. So it gets very muddy when we discuss this history. It's history that people sometimes don't like to discuss, but it has to be, because it needs to be remembered, no matter how good or bad it is, because that's the only way you learn from your mistakes. So, and also to keep that information flowing so people in the future know what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it was striking me more and more today. I mean, 1919 was what they called the bloody or the Red Summer, because there was race riots all over America during the Spanish epidemic, the Spanish flu epidemic. So I mean, talk about history repeating itself. This is just unbelievable. You don't have to look into ancient history to see the importance of knowing history. And let's talk about, as you were starting to get into the kind of removal of Native Americans and maybe any sign that they were ever here in the first place, how the Robinson Woods, and so this area, which is right by O'Hare, it was a gifted, a deeded area from the government to the Robinson family in recognition and thanks for the service Alexander Robinson, the services that he conducted, and eventually Robinson family descendants were buried on this property at some point, and at some point that cemetery just kind of vanished to time.
Mm-hmm.
And not even ancient history. At one point were there still regular headstones
1925.
1925.
Actually, it goes further than that.
I thought so.
All the way through the 40s. But yeah, 1925 was, or I'm sorry, not 1925. 1927 was the last burial in January. That was Mary Ragger, Chief's daughter.
There we go.
Alexander Robinson's daughter. Yeah.
And so something that really is what made us continue to work together early on in our knowing each other and our friendship was trying to figure out what in the world happened to these stones, and through your intense diligence and pestering phone calls and follow up, there's a not that we have everything, but there's definitely some positive updates to the story. I don't know how much you want to talk about.
Well, Scott is correct. I am a pain in the ass. The thing is that it took a lot of time, a lot of research, and it wasn't just me. It was many people that had a hand in it. I know I could be egotistical, but I need to recognize many people who had a hand in it, and Scott was right there next to me when we did this. Scott and the direct descendant Verlin Buzz Spreeman, the three of us are the ones that physically went to retrieve the stones, but it took a team of many people, professional archaeologists with the state of Illinois, and a friend of mine who is a cemetery restorationist, as well as many different historians. I just happened to be the one that was the big, again, pain in the ass to keep pushing for it. And, you know, after a while, people either wear down and get tired of it, or they want to see these things corrected. And I'm lucky enough that these people wanted to right the wrongs that happened in the past. Now, the stones were removed, believe it or not, for the right reasons. But over time, they were hidden for the wrong reasons. It sort of became one of those things where, you know, they worked with the family to preserve the cemetery, and then they realized what they did over time as social opinion changed. And the stones went from, hey, we saved them, to, oh crap, we just desecrated Native American burial ground. But at the end of the day, it all worked out. The family, they have their stones. Verlin, or we call him Buzz. His nickname is Buzz.
For David, bring him over here to the end.
And the official Robinson family historian. But yeah, no, Scott is right there next to us. He's part of the team.
He died in the Civil War.
The
archaeologist is kind of twitching. So I'm just going to grab it on a cracky part. You can grab it from there. And
Here, I'll pull this out. Pull this straight out.
Pivot.
It was awesome. Just to meet Buzz, to meet somebody that had a blood connection to Alexander Robinson was amazing to me. We've got a question, and you guys have submitted a whole bunch of questions over the last couple of days, and I'm going to get to those probably next. We can also get into some of our own personal stories. We got some awesome war stories over the years, so however long people want to hang out. But first, this question is, my mother used to go with her father to the tallest hill on Midlothian Road in Sylvan Lake, so this is in Mundelein, Illinois, and collect arrowheads. She said a Black Hawk battle had occurred there. Is that possible, or just a tale?
That's a tale. If they're collecting spear points, those are prehistoric materials, and those would be thousands of years old. Also, I'd be interested in the location if you want to message Scott privately so I can add it to the database that I've been putting together for, God, now over 20 years. But yeah, no, people in the Black Hawk War at this point would have been using rifles and what have you. So many farmers, when they find arrow points or spear points or, you know, arrowheads, the quote-unquote arrowhead, not every stone tool is an arrowhead. The bow and arrow didn't come around until what is called basically the late woodland period. But people have been using stone tools like that for thousands of years, as spears or knives, things like that. But essentially, there might have been a large encampment there or a village site, depending on what was found. Now, I don't know. You know, unfortunately, I can't see your artifacts to tell you what period they're from, but I can tell you that it's not from a Black Hawk battle. Most likely, again, it was just a prehistoric site, village, hunting ground, something along those lines. And if it's a natural hill, not a man-made hill or human-made hill, if it's one of those things, a natural hill, it would be a prominent position for prehistoric people to hunt from. I don't know how high the hill is, but essentially you probably can see for a few miles if the terrain were clear during that period. Now it's probably a sledding hill or something along those lines. If it's natural, most likely the glaciers created it. I know that around here we do have those things, many places in Lake County especially. So
yeah, so I mean, just because it's not connection to Black Hawk, it still could be a very historically relevant
I think it's
finding.
Very cool. So I would love to know that location.
Okay, so I want to tell one of my favorite stories. This is not a haunted location, but this was the moment, I don't know, that I'll always think of as my highlight reel of going for a walk with Dan. And we were up here in Lake County, and it was a site that had some historic cabins still standing on it, and you wanted to kind of show me around.
Yes.
And so, for those of you who don't know, when stone tools are made, they are chipped away at. So you have a source rock, and you can fix me on terminology.
Yeah,
but
chert.
yes, you have a piece of chert, it's type of stone, and that is chipped away and fashioned and formed into whatever tool you're trying to make. And so finding those flakes, chert flakes, is a clue that, well, there was some habitation here during that time period when stone tools existed and were used. And very commonly, I would say, "Oh, hey Dan, is this a flake?" And he'd throw it away. No, and just keep walking. And so we got to a point where we're walking on this trail, and I see something that looks like a flake to me, but it's kind of bigger than I would expect. So I really hesitated, but I gave it to you, and you said, "Ooh, this is interesting. Where'd you find that?" And then we started looking around. And we did find a handful of other flakes. And then I saw what to me looked like maybe there was a sidewalk in more recent time period here. There were some very flat stones, not much space in between them. So, as if you were laying down a sidewalk to a house that is now gone. And I said, "What is this?" And he's like, "Oh, well, that's fire-cracked rock," meaning like rock that was built into a fireplace and the heat from the fire cracked those stones. And so for me, I thought like, oh, well, that could have been some people just having a campfire here last weekend. It might not be. I didn't know that fire was used to make the stones more brittle at that point. And eventually, we continue to look around. I'm getting goosebumps now, going back to this moment, because Dan picked up this rock. And he said, "Scott, come here." It's like, "Look at this," and describe to me what you're seeing. And I could see on his arms that he was full of goosebumps. And to me, it just looked like he was holding a rock. I didn't have that knowledge still. I still probably wouldn't know. But it was, what exactly? It was a grinding stone?
Grinding stone, yeah.
So
it would have been used to basically grind whatever food materials into meal, essentially. Very smooth on one side, rounded around the edges. Had a few scuffs in it from grinding over the years. But it was definitely a grindstone. It had a nice sheen on the underside, very soft to the touch. That area was littered with chert flakes, and I have found stone tools there in the past. Aside from the grinding stone, I found a preform stone tool, which is, the tool hasn't been completed yet. It's just a blank. So it looks like a point. But it hasn't been finished yet. So whether it was going to turn into a knife or a spear or something like that, it wasn't finished. But that place is absolutely loaded with prehistoric activity. And then, of course, you got the historic side of it. So I started looking at aerial photos before I went there, and again, found pine trees and things like that. Through the canopy, you can see all of the deciduous trees, the oak trees, and what have you. And then you see the different color of trees in one area or a few areas throughout, and it turned out to be pine trees, and sure enough on the ground they were pine trees. And again, you've got building foundations and flagstones and things like that. So it's a heavily used site, multi-component site, prehistoric and historic. So
and then the fascinating insight, which again, you as an archaeologist would know this off, as if it's part of your DNA. So the thing is about this grinding stone is it's not a special item, which means it's not something that you would be traveling with, meaning that this is very possibly a village site that we didn't quite know about before.
Right.
So that was
with
the capper.
With the amount of material there, it could either be a large village or a small village, or even an encampment where they just left and stored things. But there's enough material there to at least lead me to believe that something big was going on several thousand years ago. I mean, to the north of that site, there were someone put in a foundation of a house and found a giant stone axe head. About 5,000 years old, and just a hair to the north of that, there were mounds all over the place. And when they turned a portion of that location into a gravel mine in the 50s, they uncovered human remains, and one was of a 3,000-year-old girl from the mound, when she was covered in thousands of beads. So Lake County still has these things. I mean, we've still got mounds everywhere. There are prehistoric sites everywhere. It's I'm just not going to give away those secrets.
Yeah. Well, and the really awesome thing about that is, I have the idea before getting to know you and getting to know about all this is that archaeology means you're digging all the time, and all of the things that we found were just sitting on the surface, thousands of years old, just sitting on top of the dirt. Amazing. All right, so we have some smart-ass questions. I'm still going to give a shout-out because I appreciate everybody who commented anything. One is, where's the Ark, and who are the top men?
All right, so who's that, Huberty?
So that's Antho up in Madison.
All right, let's have a lash at that.
Yeah.
So the Ark of the Covenant, I believe, is in Axum, Ethiopia, and if you've been following Graham Hancock and Josh Gates, by the way, he's a fake archaeologist, but anyway, I digress. Josh Gates and several others, Axum, Ethiopia, I feel, is the quite honestly, if I were to go and look for it, if this were serious, I would actually go there because they've convinced me.
Wow.
If it exists, if it still exists, I absolutely believe it's in Axum, Ethiopia. You don't have a belief system set up like that to the point where you need to guard something in that church. I think it's Church of St. Mary or something along those lines. But, I mean, something is in there. I don't know. I would be very excited to find out.
I didn't expect to get a serious answer off of that.
Well,
so good job, Antho,
Excellent
for bringing it. A question asked by Jack Blue, the subfield of archaeomythology. And do you guys use that, the intersection of folklore and archaeology?
Actually, we do. We have to. And I know Scott does as well. Whenever we look at a site, depending on where we are, we always have to look into the folklore. Whether it's Scott looking into the haunted folklore or mythology that's been created recently, and I would say within the past couple 200 years. But even with me working with indigenous people, you always have to respect and look into the folklore and tie it in, because it's their belief system and they are the ones that created these things, and we need that insight to help to explain. It's always good to have more interpretation for a site by using folklore and mythology and what have you.
That could also help you understand what you're looking at. If you find an artifact that has some weird symbol on it, you'd understand the importance of that piece then. Right,
and it helps also, for example, in Kenya too, where you're dealing with groups who live very traditional lifestyles. And here I come, a Westerner, walking in, and I want to see a site or work on a site. I mean, back in, 2004, I was on the side of a mountainside, and I wanted to see a specific site where a local witch worked out of, and it was a rock shelter. And I had to convince my guide and the people that were with me to take me there, and we had to go about it the long way around by looking at the folklore and discussing these things with them, and to basically let them know that we weren't there to disrespect anything or cause trouble. I just wanted to go in, see the site, photograph it, and walk away. We got to the site, and fortunately nothing was there. The quote-unquote witch had come and gone and brought her things with her. So I did go to the site, though. It was, a crack in the rock with a rock shelter around it, but unfortunately there was nothing with witchcraft left over. So,
and I brought Dan out to a supposedly former site of a witch encampment in Wadsworth, Illinois, as well. So, yes. Okay, so I'm going to combine two. So you'll have two answers for this one. So we have Vic in Austin, Texas, rock on Vic, and John Dreiska out in New Jersey. So John asks, what find surprised you the most when you're out in the field? Did you come across something that, for whatever reason, stands out as something surprising? And then Vic asks, what is the coolest object you found? So these could be the same item, they could be separate.
Yeah, I mean, God, I've got so many. That's the thing, and this is always the hardest question to answer. I have found hundreds of sites in Kenya, and there was one rock shelter that I went into, and I found human skull fragments in the dirt. We left them there, of course. We recorded this site, photographed them. My friend is a prominent Kenyan archaeologist, but he teaches here. He's in the United States. He was head of African anthropology at the field. So we recorded those sites and moved on. I have found many large prehistoric sites up in the mountains where people said things didn't exist, and there they were. As for here in the Chicagoland area, it never ceases to amaze me when I find prehistoric things, just about everywhere, quite honestly, or see these mounds still there, even after urban expansion. They were here long before any of that, but to find these things is awe-inspiring. And to answer that second question, the best artifact is, quite honestly, a couple of artifacts. Obviously, the Robinson headstones that we retrieved. That was something, all kidding aside, that I've been after since I was a child, because I was a dork in first grade, and that's how archaeology happens. It happened in the first grade, and that's when I got interested in it. And so coming across Robinson and knowing that there was this Native American burial site near my house, I became interested in that. Had my grandfather drive me out, and we did the research, and I saw the headstones, and no one knew where the headstones went. And we found them. We did something Chicago historians had been trying to do since they went lost. And we also found the ciborium of Father St. Cyr. Ciborium is used during the Eucharist. And so to find that wooden ciborium was pretty cool, because Father St. Cyr was the priest that Chief Alexander Robinson and Caldwell petitioned with the other American settlers back in 1883 to come up from St. Louis, and he brought with him in 1833 that ciborium. And he came up, and when they opened the first church in October of 1833, he gave mass to 300 Potawatomi, and he had that ciborium with him. I've only ever seen it in a book, black and white photo from 1914. And to be able to pin it down, no one knew where it was. Scott was there. He helped find it. It was a 5-minute find.
Yeah.
Walked in. They didn't even know they had it. I was like, here it is. And then I turned to Scott. I go, what are we going to do with the rest of the day now? It was the fastest find of my life. All they had to do was turn on the lights. They absolutely had no idea they had it.
And that helps illustrate or color the fact that you hear these stories about this artifact exists and it was in so-and-so's collection and now it's lost. Like, that happens even today. You think everything is scanned and just really taken care of 6 ways to Sunday, and things still get lost, even in this modern tech age. There was another very practical question from Jack Blue, so I want to get that out, which is, who funds archaeological digs?
Oh, that's many people. You've got grant money coming from public and private organizations. You've got government funds. And then many archaeologists work for Cultural Resource Management, CRM. And so they are privately owned in many cases, and they're for a contract or for a profit, contract archaeology. So they'll pay for their own work. My friends with the state, our taxes pay for these things. So it depends on what kind of archaeology we're talking with. Do you work for the government? Do you work for yourself? Do you work for a university, in which case you've got the university paying you plus grant money? Do you work for a museum? Do you work for the museum and the university? These things mesh quite a bit.
Cool.
Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Money can come from anywhere.
And you'll take it,
And
wherever you can get it.
We'll take it.
So I know Christy Strauss asked a really great question, which is, it's hard to answer it for one sweeping answer because every case is going to be different. But she's essentially asking and acknowledging, I have to say, that the fact that archaeology isn't just being in the field digging, that there's a lot of work in an office, in libraries beforehand. So about how much time goes into the research stage before you get to the point that you're out in the field?
Well, let's put it this way. I'm always in the research stage.
Yeah.
I'm a research archaeologist. I'm not going to lie. My excavation skills, last time I excavated anything was in 2012. Yeah, 2012. I've been out in the field looking at things, and my trowels hit dirt. I'm not, but to excavate something professionally, 2012. I spent a lot of time in the library, in the archives. I know this sounds like a line from Indiana Jones. Was it movie 5? The crappy one. But anyway, I spent a lot of time in the library, a lot of time in the archives, a lot of time visiting universities and historical societies and interviewing people. And again, Scott has joined me on many of these outings to find the information that we need in order to go out and preserve sites.
We have two from Ursula Bielski. One is, who is the old dude sitting next to me?
Oh, that would be Scott. Scott's sitting next to me, the old dude.
And I really love this question because I've been able to walk a little bit into the backstage area at the Field Museum, thanks to you. That's maybe 10%, maybe less of artifacts.
Like 1% or 2% of their stuff is on display. Everything else is in the back. And I had the good fortune, because I, did things with them in one way or another since 1997, to see many of the back room collection. I mean, the collection rooms are just amazing. When I worked with my friend Chap in the African anthropology department, he's that African archaeologist I spoke about earlier. My research interest was in Egypt and Ushapti, the little statues, the funerary statues. And I had a key. I had my own key. And I'd go into the collections room and walk by myself and open drawers back in 97, 2000, 2001, all the way through the early 2000s. And I just by myself, I'd wear my lab coat, walk in, open drawers, look through things. One aisle, I'm pulling things out from Rome, another aisle, things from Peru, another aisle, things from the Southwest, and then, of course, aisles of Egypt and Africa. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing to see those things. So
yeah. So her actual question is, what's your favorite artifact that the public isn't able to see right now?
So it's interesting because I crawled under it. It's in the oversized room at the Field Museum. I crawled under it, and this thing weighs several tons. It's the basalt sarcophagus lid. So when you go to the Field Museum and you go downstairs, the elevator goes down to the lower level, and it opens up, and you have this big black sarcophagus, this basalt sarcophagus, there in the hall near the McDonald's, I believe. And the lid is off in storage. And it was kind of funny because I had to relocate that lid. At the time, no one could tell me where it was. So I went off by myself with my key into the Field Museum's vaults to look for these things, and I found it. And I brought Chap down and another archaeologist, and we had the idea to bring it out and to install it or join it with its sarcophagus out on display, but we were told it's so heavy that they didn't have the machines to move it or anything. But so I crawled under it, and I took a flashlight looking up into it, and you can see all the hieroglyphs and everything that was written on the underside, which was really cool to crawl under. Another one is now they've moved departments around quite a bit, but there are offices down there. And if you go into this one office, I don't know what department it is now because it has changed, and they have an entire they have a little temple in there, but it's walled off. There's a wall. They literally walled all around it, except for this little hole in the wall. And so I walked in and I asked about it, and she said, oh yeah, it's behind that picture. And they moved the picture, and I took a chair, climbed onto the chair with my flashlight, climbed into the hole in the wall, and there I stood in this temple that was, or this little temple, this little room that's been closed off for God knows how long, and it's an Egyptian room in a little, small Egyptian temple. It was really cool, and again, beautiful hieroglyphs and things like that. The one room that I have always wanted to go in and never had access to was the gold room, and I've only ever taken the elevator up. Doors open, and there's the door to it, but it requires many keys and combinations, and my friend never, we just never, for some reason, got into it. But I've always wanted to see the gold room, and unfortunately never got to get into it. So
well, it's still on your bucket list then.
Yeah,
that was I was going to ask actually. We'll get to this later, but I wanted to ask about bucket list locations because you have been to so many incredible locations around the world that there still must be some that are like while I'm still upwardly mobile, I'm going to go here, here, and here before it's all said and done. Ursula asked another question, which is similar to one that I think Chuck Martin asked. I can't find it anymore, but so Chuck, who's a great friend out of Indiana, asked if you've ever been doing anything on site and had a paranormal experience, basically. Ursula said she and her daughter and colleagues cannot be in the field more than maybe an hour because the heaviness is palpable. So again, we are on a paranormal site here. Obviously, I'm all for it. Did you ever feel anything like that, whether it's at the Field Museum or anywhere else in the field? Yes, I'm pushing because he doesn't really like talking about
this
publicly.
So here's the thing. Yes, I have twice, but I'm going to need a lot more of these.
We can make it happen.
And Scott knows that when I start having more of these, or whiskeys especially, hint hint, that I will start telling stories of weird paranormal occurrences. But I did have one happen to me in Wisconsin, and this is the first time anybody aside from a handful of people have heard this story, so this is going over to who's ever listening now. But I was at a site in Wisconsin, and we were headquartered in an old farmhouse. Okay, so we were excavating a rock shelter, but a few miles away we were in a farmhouse, and it had a dilapidated narrow staircase going up to the second floor. Now the year before I had been there and nothing happened, but I knew of the ghost. And mind you, these were professional archaeologists, and they all told me the ghost itself always showed itself to a woman for whatever reason. And so this year I stayed upstairs, second floor, same room that I had stayed in before, but this time I only had one other person in the room. Before there were quite a few people, and we slept on cots. And so that day I had a very bad experience with someone from back home. I got off of the phone, hung up, it was after dinner, and I walking around having my soda or whatever. And after a while, we had our conversations, everybody's going to bed. So I go upstairs, and it starts to thunder. You sound the thunder, lightning, the whole nine yards. It's going to storm out. And I don't need to tell anybody who spent time out in the open, but when thunder hits, it sounds like a bomb going off. So I couldn't close my eyes, I couldn't sleep or anything. So I laid there and stewing over the annoying phone call that I had earlier in the day. And finally, I thought about the ghost, and I said aloud, "You know what? Just come and get me." famous last words. Smart move. So, got my eyes closed, and I hear the clock chiming downstairs, 10 o'clock. Ding, ding, ding. You know how clocks do. And I'm laying on my back on the cot, looking up, and there is an apparition this way. I'm laying this way. The head is here, the body is here, feet are here, and she's slowly coming down. She's wearing a dress. Her face was all blacked out, had a bonnet, and slowly lowering herself. I flipped out of the cot. I shit you not. I flipped out of the cot, kicked the guy next to me awake. He woke up annoyed. I wouldn't blame him. And we looked around, nothing, there was nothing. So I took everything that I had, and I'm in this cot. It's hot. There's no air conditioning in this farmhouse. Pulled the covers up, and sweat pouring out of everything. The next day, I come downstairs, and at breakfast, the director of the site, he just passed away actually last year. The director of the site came down, or out from outside. He stayed in a mobile home, and his girlfriend also had a mobile home. And he came in, and I told him of the experience. And he said about that time his radio decided to play music. He said the odd thing is that it doesn't run on batteries. It's plugged into the wall, and the power box, the fuses and everything, they were in my room, in the room upstairs. So
that's awesome.
That's one.
Yeah, that is awesome.
Yes, and you got me when I was still sober.
Well, you'd think that because you care so much about what you do, you end up feeling empathetic towards the people whose stories you're trying to tell. Which I always love to come up with theories. So that might make you more open because you're really you're not trying to do it on some psychic paranormal level, but you just are, I would assume, way more open to having some sort of a contact from the other side. So I want to ask Mark Johnson's question next. This one's been sitting for a while, but it's a great one because it is mind-boggling to think that a whole city could exist and then somehow vanish, and a whole new city is on top of it, and we didn't even know there was a city underneath it originally.
Like a tell.
What's that?
A tell. Cities been built on cities. Yeah.
There we go. So basically, he was just asking, how does this even happen?
Oh, it's just constant building and rebuilding. So when you look at San Francisco, for example, and this happens anywhere really, but San Francisco was built up over a period of time that they have an entire underground that used to be above ground at one point. So it's just that people build on things and forget about them, quite honestly. And it's been happening. I mean, there are areas in the world, and I don't need to tell you this, or anybody for that matter, that you just have so many periods of civilization coming and going and coming and going, and just building and rebuilding to the point where it's just city built upon city. I'm always amazed out here, in the country, when you see that brand new beautiful home, or not brand new, I should say. Okay, the home was built in, let's say, the 1980s, right? And they tear it down and they find a log cabin from 1843 because they just built around it, and then they expanded beyond that. So it just happens, It's like anything with expansion.
It's always amazing to me too, though, just the force of nature when it comes to a city that was once a metropolis, and then for whatever number of reasons, whether it be plagues or political upheaval or whatever, that it gets abandoned, and then suddenly it's under 20 feet of earth that the earth can just swallow up so much. Now, of course, things fall down as well. But
well, I mean, look at Pompeii, Herculaneum. Even look at the structures. What is it? Mount St. Helens. Yeah. Right. Just buried. Done. There's a guy and his wife. They had, I think it was a resort. Don't quote me on any of this. I watched a special. It was really interesting. But I think they had like a little resort. And now they're literally buried under 20 feet of muck,
Another vastly different topic, the Lions of Tsavo.
So the ghost in the darkness. So Colonel Patterson is the one that he killed the lions, who killed, the legend or the lore states that it was several hundred people. The numbers themselves probably go up to really, quite honestly, 60. The scientists at the Field Museum have studied those skulls, the teeth, and things like that. And based on the findings, it's more likely they killed about 60, maybe less people. But they were still man-eaters, and they did what they did, and basically they made an entire empire come to a halt. Because Colonel Patterson had to build that bridge across the River Tsavo. I have been there. I've been to the man-eaters' den. I rode over the bridge twice. The bridge itself was destroyed in World War I, but the pylons are still there, the ones that Patterson put in. And when we took the train from Nairobi to Voi, and from Voi back to Nairobi, we had to go over that bridge twice. I highly recommend that you read Colonel Patterson's book about Tsavo, about the man-eaters of Tsavo. That's the title. And then even thumbing through this guy Phil Caputo's book, I recommend reading that, because Phil Caputo, when I was there in 2000 for 2 months, we went to the man-eaters' den. And the man-eaters' den in the movie, it shows that it's littered with human remains, skeleton or bones just everywhere. Lions just don't do that at all. They don't even have a den like that. It's what Patterson didn't realize is that it was a burial site. And the Taita people will actually bury their dead and then exhume, like a year later, the skulls and put them on a rock shelf, on a shelf in the rock shelter. And they still do this. I mean, you can go to Kenya and certain rock shelters and see the skulls lined up, and people can tell you exactly who is who, going back, back about 100 or so years. But Caputo was out there. This book was written, I think, in 2001. He was out there when I was there in 2000, and he took photos with National Geographic of me as well as the team out in front of the man-eaters den. Now I've got my own photos. He never even mentions any of this stuff or my my professor. So there's a little bit of animosity, at least because of my professor not being mentioned. He's the most prominent man who excavated that site.
First printing 2002. And just for more context, it was late 1800s is when all of this
the
was going
1890s. But there are photos in here from 2000 when he was on that expedition. So I had thumbed through this book earlier. Yeah. It's a very interesting story. The movie is great. I love the movie. Some people don't like it, whatever. But it's a fun movie. But the reality of it is much better. And
again, back to the Field Museum as well.
Yeah, and it goes back to the Field Museum. Patterson sold the hides to the Field Museum in the 1920s to the Field Museum. He had turned the hides into rugs, and the taxidermists took the hides and created the mounts that you see today at the Field Museum.
What an incredible story, though. Even if the numbers are exaggerated, the fact that there were just suddenly these two animals are like, oh, the buffet's in town.
That's exactly what it was. You had a massive buffet and two hungry lions who didn't care.
Yeah. So here's the question. I prompted a little bit earlier, but what are the locations, historical, whether you're there just to visit or there to be on a dig or exploration, where in the world do you still really want to go?
Peru.
Peru, okay.
I'd love to go look for those lost cities in Peru because they're there and they are real. People are exploring Peru today and in the Amazon, at least that side of the Amazon, for Incan cities. The thing is that what people don't realize in this day and age, 21st century, believe it or not, there are many places that are quote-unquote unexplored. By that I mean they're not mapped. They just don't fall onto a map. I know people live in certain places, and how can you call this unexplored when people are there? I'm talking about being mapped. Physical boots being on the ground to map out the terrain, the things that are there. And I have been in areas where locals don't even know that certain things exist because you got to remember, these people are living there. They're going about their day-to-day lives. They're not out looking for these things. So even for them, it's usually quite a shock when something comes to light too. There's no need to go bushwhacking in the jungle to look for a lost city when you have an entire farm to care for and your family and your animals and things like that. You'd rather live than go play explorer. But the jungles are vast down there, and there are places where people just don't go. And if they do, then they're, it's not the people who are living on the farms; it's the tribes that live in the jungle, and they're not going to give up their secrets. So yeah, Peru would be a wonderful place. The Amazon, would be kind of fun to walk through.
Some lost city of Z.
Yeah, why not? Zed, right? Up over in Mato Grosso.
What is the most dangerous situation you found yourself in?
I've had malaria. I've been with people next to me in the same Land Rover with typhoid, bleach poisoning. We've been bitten up by tsetse flies, had scorpions all over the place, the mamba snakes, things like that. But there was one point where I went into a cave, a very massive rock shelter cave. It's a lava tube, and it's in Mount Elgon. Mount Elgon is an extinct volcano. It's on the border of Uganda and Kenya. And I made my way deeper and deeper into this lava tube, and all I had was a guide and two village children. The kids follow people. And so the four of us went into this lava tube, and we explored to the point where the tube itself, was only so tall, or so big to fit us, and we had the one flashlight. And I remember turning off the flashlight, and just that silence was deafening. But we were so far in, and when I turned off the flashlight, it was then I realized, okay, yeah, we only have one flashlight. We only have the batteries in that flashlight. There's nothing more. If this flashlight malfunctions, I'd still be in that rock shelter. So it took us about a good maybe half hour to climb back out of that thing, back into daylight. But I did find a vein of rubies. I've showed you the rubies, right?
Yeah.
So awesome. That's not, chipped them out. It's only a handful, not gem quality by any stretch, but they were rubies found.
And not historical artifacts.
Yeah, not historical artifacts. That would have been
come along home.
Massively illegal. But it's only a small amount anyway. But
but no, I mean that's one of the things that too I meant to bring up earlier, how wild it is sometimes we find these items out in the woods, out in the wild, and we can drool over them as we're looking at them and holding them. In fact, we just put them right back on the ground and walk away. Cover them
up
safety.
And walk away. Yeah, it's against state and federal laws to remove any artifacts. We record them, field notes, write them down, photograph the hell out of them, take the waypoints with the GPS, and then we walk away. And we do the same thing in other countries too. It's against state and federal. It's against the laws of those countries and the antiquity trade, all that stuff, to remove things out of these countries too. So
I want to share a story, not nearly as perilous, but it rang a bell. I was out in eastern Tennessee visiting my aunt, uncle, and cousins. So shout out Jack, Danette, Cody, and Elliot. And driving to their home, I had to drive for a little while down a street called Indian Cave Street. So of course, as soon as I pull up to the house, I thought, why is that called Indian? Streets have names for a reason, so why is that called Indian Cave Street? And I said, oh, well, we'll show you later. And a couple days later, we get some canoes and we go down a river, then get out on the other side. And unfortunately, because it was a discovered and known location, obviously, it's not like we were finding anything that had never been found before. I mean, there's a freaking street named after it. But it was turned into, sadly, a tourist attraction. As we talk about Robinson Wood's Native American Burial Ground, there used to be signs on the expressway to go visit the real authentic Indian burial ground.
Yeah,
and
what they had.
At this same time period, this location, which apparently was used by Native Americans in eastern Tennessee, probably mid-1900s, was when that was kind of a tourism thing. So it wasn't going to be this locked in time place, but I still thought, okay, well, there's going to be a little area where they probably let the tourists in and take some photos and then get them back on the road, this roadside attraction thing. And I was all excited about going in and seeing what artifacts were left behind, because this is a very rural area. So it's not like we're in Memphis or anything. And first off, it's blocked, and we have to scale this wall to get into it, which was fun and perilous in and of itself, part of the adventure. And then we get in, we start to get to the point where you're not seeing very much of the daylight anymore. It's really, really dark. We had flashlights, but that was that. And first off, the thing I noticed was that the ground was very soft. And I thought, this doesn't feel like ground as I know it. And then realized, well, what it was, which I'll reveal in a second here. Eventually, we get further back in there, and I hear the sound of I couldn't tell if it was rushing wind or rushing water. I thought maybe there's some little ventilation shaft somewhere back here, and we're hearing just wind howling by. And eventually we shine our flashlights further deeper into the cave, and you just saw a wall of bats swirling like a tornado of bats. And then they were attracted to us, or maybe they were curious, I don't know. So we turned around and started to walk out with bats. Just, you don't see them until they're right next to you. And so, of course, why the ground was so soft was that it was probably 5 inches of bat guano that would be covering any cool artifact that could possibly be in there. So that's another hazard.
So, yeah, I mean, the same thing happened in those rock shelters in Kenya, the big ones. It's just, you've got thousands of bats flying everywhere. And the ground itself, it's like moon dust. So you're kicking it around, but the thing is, it's soaked with bat urine and bat feces and things like that. it wasn't uncommon for us to walk through those tubes and have bats just shooting past us. In fact, when I was in the Temple of Edfu in Egypt, so it was 1996, and I had my professor, his sister, and her 2 nieces, and a group of other people. But the one niece and I had a knack for getting into trouble, as one does in Egypt. And so there were holes, or I should say, openings in the floor in the temple. And I climbed into the opening, and then she followed. And we were on our hands and knees because it was a narrow tunnel. Again, I know this sounds like BS, but it's true, I assure you. And we came up to a corner. I had a bat just fly and hit me right in the face, and just there it was, and I just sort of pushed it off. We turned the corner, and we kept crawling. And sooner or later, we saw a little daylight, and we heard people speaking. And we got, sure enough, there was a shaft of sunlight. And I poked my head through the hole in the ceiling, and happened to be looking at a tour guide with about 20 French tourists while she's explaining the hole in the ground. So, helped my professor's niece out of the ground first, put my hat on the ground because we all have our hats, and then I climbed out of it, and we just walked away like nothing happened. But yeah, bats are everywhere in the caves in Kenya, and I've been hit by them more often than not.
We had so many awesome questions. So I think everybody who joined in, who asked the question, I'm pretty sure we answered everybody's. Until next week, stay safe, keep exploring, enjoy yourself, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you all very much for everything.